I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I wanted to talk for a few minutes about Pentateuchal criticism, specifically source criticism. There's always questions when you read the text about what does JEDP mean? How does it relate to interpretation? Where do these things come from? Well, these are all products of post-Enlightenment biblical scholarship when scholars, instead of simply focusing on the final form of the text and basing all interpretive activities on reading the text essentially as an artifact, scholars began to gain some historical perspectives and began to explain certain features in the text, not so much how they work together in the final form of the text, but how these features emerged historically through the process of the formation of the text. This is where the process of looking at that world out of which the text emerged came into focus. This is called a diachronic way of reading the text. In other words, explaining the final form of the text through its historical processes that brought it about. Now, when we talk about source criticism, when we're talking about J, E, D, and P, and again, these are just four broad categories. If you read extensively on source criticism, you'll find that different scholars have different opinions about what each of these four streams mean, and also about which passages within the Pentateuch actually make up each of these four streams. And I'm using the word stream intentionally because there's different kinds of source criticism. In some source criticism, especially in its original proponents, you had essentially documentary view of the sources. And what a documentary view of the sources meant is that early source critics believed that the final form of the Pentateuch was the product of essentially four JEDP documents. In other words, entire records that were then woven together to form a final text. In other words, it would be like taking four books. Like if we go to the New Testament, if we would take Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, four documents, four wholes, and then put them all together into a new text, that would be what a documentary hypothesis would be. Now I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes the kind of classic documentary hypothesis done by Julius Wellhausen. He's probably the most famous proponent of a documentary view of the sources. But I also want you to be aware, especially as you read other sources, look at commentaries and such in your interpretive work now and really for the rest of your interpretive career, other persons will use JEDP not so much as four individual documents, but they'll also maybe assume that one of these was a coherent whole document, that then the other sources that were used were simply fragmentaries or they're just supplemental to this one main document. So you'll also find as you read supplemental views or supplementary hypothesis. Again, this is where we have one main document and then fragments of other documents or just pure fragments that are then collected together and added to the one main document. And then many theories of source criticism will, though they still may use JEDP, will see these as essentially just streams into which all kinds of different fragments are put together. So this is more like a mosaic. And so J or E or D or P wouldn't be a coherent document. It would just essentially be a collection of originally unconnected fragments of tradition, if you will. Again, we can say more about this. This is just to give you a taste of what we're looking for. Now, also when we're talking about sources, most scholars view these sources by using a set of criteria by which they then separate sources out of the final form of the text. Now, this is important. There, other than a few scraps of just fragments of the original biblical text that have been found, there's never been found outside of a biblical text a J document, an E document, a D document, a P document, or fragments that went into these things. And so all source criticism is essentially a hypothesis. It's a test. Again, this isn't to discredit it, because certainly there are explicit mentioning of sources within the Pentateuch. Like, for example, you'll have the book of Jasher is mentioned a few different places in the Old Testament, or if you think of the Kings, the books of the Annals of the Kings. So there are explicit references to sources, just that none of these have ever been found by themselves. So how do scholars get the sources? Well, the basic criteria that have been used, probably the most famous one has just been the idea of the use of divine names. Some texts use Yahweh, some texts use Elohim, some texts use El Shaddai, that kind of thing. So some sources can be derived by the use of divine names. Other scholars use things such as doublets. In other words, what's a doublet? Well, Genesis opens with a couple of different creation stories. There's multiple times in Genesis when either Abraham or Isaac says that his wife is his sister. And scholars would argue that those were doublets. Those were the same story that derived from a different source. Another criteria would be tensions that show up in tensions that show up in the narrative where things are obviously just in tension. So when you read the flood story, are there 7 of each animal, or are there just pairs? Again, there's ways of talking about that and maybe explaining it, but that would be a criterion, a tension that shows up in the text. Also, orientation in terms of the readership or the setting. Scholars observe that certain of the patriarchs were from northern sites, certain of the patriarchs were from southern sites. Language. Moses' father-in-law is known as both Jethro and Ruel. Mount Sinai is also called Mount Horeb. There's other things like that, and so that have been used to designate different sources. And also theology. Does some texts, like think about Genesis 1, the creation, where you have this transcendent view of God. Genesis 2, you have God actually walking around in the garden talking to the first man and the first woman. That would be a different in theological perspective, more transcendent or more immanent. So those would be the criteria that would be used. So divine names, doublets, tensions, orientation of the reader, language, and theology. Now, what's important to know is not that just that these things were used to separate out the text, was that source critics would argue that these differences coalesce into specific texts. So it's not just that there's different divine names, but that all of these things coordinate to help them to divide texts into certain sources. Now, let's go back to J, E, D, and P, and let me show you and talk for a minute about what that looks like. Now let's talk about the 4 sources themselves. And again, I'm giving the classic example here. Again, review our textbook, read about, especially in the context of Genesis and our Dillard Longman text, how they talk about the different movements beyond what we're going to say about Julius Wellhausen. But this is essentially the starting point so you get a sense of this. Now, in classic source criticism, we have the Yahwistic source, the J source. The reason you get a J and not a Y is in German, it starts with a J rather than a Y. The Elohistic source, the Deuteronomic source, the priestly source. What do these do? The Yahwistic source is the places where God's name is principally Yahweh, which is, we get capital L-O-R-D in our English texts. In the Elohistic text, God is known as Elohim up until we get to Exodus chapter 3, where God reveals his name as Yahweh on Mount Sinai. The Deuteronomic source, now in much source criticism, this is essentially just the book of Deuteronomy. So note that in a lot of source criticism, Genesis through Numbers are essentially combinations of J, E, and P, with Deuteronomy being separate. Now, over the last 100 years, Deuteronomy, there's been Deuteronomic Source that's found in other parts of the Pentateuch as well. So you can think of Deuteronomic at least as the book of Deuteronomy, but also the language of Deuteronomy that appears in other places in the Pentateuch, though that would be what scholars debate about. Then there's the priestly source. The priestly source is texts that were related to priestly concerns. So, for example, Genesis 1, it uses, and the priestly source uses Elohim up until Exodus 6. When I talked about the Elohistic source, we talked about its text use Elohim for God up until Exodus 3. The priestly text uses Elohim and also El Shaddai up until we get to Exodus 6, where we have that calling of Moses. That's another one of the doublets, Exodus 3, Exodus 6. The priestly texts include things like the creation story in Genesis 1, the story of Abraham and Isaac and the circumcision in Genesis 17, the tabernacle story, the commissioning of Moses in Exodus chapter 6, much of the framework and the chronology and the genealogies that show up throughout the Pentateuch is the priestly source. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how this would have come together. Now, in its earliest and most convincing expression, Julius Wellhausen, a famous biblical scholar near the end of the 19th century, wrote a book called A Prolegomena to the History of Israel. And we want to write his name down, Wellhausen, a famous German scholar. And much of this source critical work was done in Germany because of its early universities, and it was in a Protestant context, so there was more academic freedom in these contexts. And so what did Wellhausen do? Wellhausen put together a fairly convincing demonstration of this that answers some key questions. Where do these sources come from? When were they written, and how were they put together into the final form? And he connected this with episodes in Israel's history. Now I'm just going to give a quick overview to show how one of the earliest and most convincing reflections on source criticism. Now, all of these positions have ultimately been critiqued both by conservative scholars, evangelicals, and also by more radical scholars into different effects. And also Jewish scholars have chipped in here and made contributions both pro and against this, what I'm going to show. But this is essentially what the consensus would have been at the end of the 19th century among critical scholars. Now, what Wellhausen said was, again, Israel emerges in the land, and they have their first king, Saul, and then David. And then during the time of Solomon, the empire, the kingdom of Judah and Israel really reaches its zenith and comes together. And Wellhausen argued that it was at that time that what would have emerged was the J source, which would have been the historical report, the historical memory of how really David comes to the throne. And so this could be associated with, that's roughly the 10th to the 9th century. It's a southern source, so it has to do with Jerusalem and the important things that revolved around the kingdoms of David and Solomon. Now, what happens as soon as Solomon's reign ends? His son Rehoboam comes to the throne, and if you recall, the kingdom splits, and then there's the northern kingdom, which is known as Israel, and the southern kingdom that's known as Judah. Now, if you're in the northern kingdom, you're going to have a different version of the history that's going to essentially privilege your perspective as a member of the kingdom of Israel. Now, it's a little harder to date this northern response, but essentially the east source, the Elohistic source, would have been the response, the northern response to the southern J document. So this we could date this roughly sometime in the 9th 8th centuries. We know it has to be at the worst in the 8th century because the northern kingdom falls when? In 722. So we know that this source had to be completed before 722. So essentially we have this northern response. And then, okay, well, how did they ever come together? Well, again, the northern kingdom falls in 722. Presumably, faithful Israelites would have fled down into the south. And we also know that around 701, King Hezekiah wins a great victory against the very forces that had destroyed the northern kingdom. The Assyrians had taken out the northern kingdom, but God delivers the southern kingdom during Hezekiah's reign in 701, and that sort of vindicates the south. But in this combination, what it suggests that somewhere post 701, so we'll basically put 7th century here, there emerged a document that put both of these together. And the R here stands for the redaction. This is the putting together, the editor of J.E. So at this point, the Pentateuch would have been these two sources. Well, what happens in the 7th century? And this is one of the linchpins. Again, you don't have to agree with this, but many critical scholars at this time came to the conclusion that Deuteronomy hadn't just been discovered during the reign of Josiah, but had been written during the time of Josiah. Again, this is a place where we can have disagreement, and later scholarship has pushed back on this position. But in Wellhausen's mind, you could date Deuteronomy. Again, another response here. Deuteronomy shows up roughly in the 620s. During the reign of Josiah, we have this document that's written, and Deuteronomy specifically calls for faithful obedience and warns against what happens if you don't have faithful obedience. Well, what happens not long after Deuteronomy's written? Yeah, you remember, it's the fall of Jerusalem. The Babylonians come in and they take out the southern kingdom. 587 is a terrible day. Jerusalem's destroyed, the temple's destroyed, and people are sent into exile. In fact, the Babylonians had defeated Judah earlier and had another round of exiles, even around 600. So 587 is kind of the end of the southern kingdom. And so now Israel's in exile. And the thought is, exile actually vindicated the message of Deuteronomy. And so at this point, sometime in roughly, again, the 6th century, you have the coming together of J.E. document and D. So now we have Deuteronomy is recognized and included as part of this holy history. And perhaps one of the weaker parts of Wellhausen's theory, another one that we could, again, will argue with, is Wellhausen argues for a priestly response. Again, what happens to God's people? They come back from exile. They begin to rebuild the temple, and we know that in the late 6th century, the second temple is built. So this is, again, late 6th century, sometime in the 5th century, we're going to get the priestly response to all of this. So we'll put the priestly response here. This is the P document. So late 6th or 5th. And the final form of the Pentateuch then emerges sometime in the 5th century. And the Pentateuch, as we know it then, is this process of development. Now, again, there's plenty of ways to critique this. So, for example, some scholars want to try to push the dates of P back. Some scholars want to work Deuteronomy backwards. And there are good arguments for that. Some radical scholars actually date all these documents really late. Now, all you really need to do is just understand what we're talking about, because ultimately, as interpreters, especially if you're going to be a pastor or a preacher, you don't preach this. These are just attempts to explain how the final form of the text came to be. There's other explanations as well. And so what's critical is you're ultimately going to preach the final form of the text. These things can be helpful sometimes to explain the historical background. We're going to say more of this about this stuff in class, but I wanted to give you a presentation. I'll also give some bibliography that will offer you some further opportunities to read or study, and also you can look at some critiques of all these things if you're interested. But this is a little taste, an introduction to issues of source criticism. Again, Wellhausen's 19th century, so this has gone way past this over the last 100 plus years. But this essentially is like the starting point for understanding really the history of source criticism. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm Brian Russell, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next time.